many years ago, after my hair went from blonde to brown, but before it went from brown to gray, I coached t-ball. I coached for 6 years or so. Now, coaching at that level was a challenge. We had to make sure the outfielders weren't picking daisies or watching the birds flying overhead. Now, notice wherever this team was playing, they solved that problem. There's no outfielders out there. We had to remind the players which way first base was. And we had to be very watchful for the kid that started the dance. You know the dance I mean. The dance that would end in a sprint to the nearest restroom. See, in a way, coaching t-ball was an escape. When I was on the field, I wasn't thinking about whatever the pressing matter of the moment at work was, or what bills needed to be paid. I was only focused on what was happening on the field. But every now and then, reality reared its head into t-ball. Our team was one player short when we started our second season. A leukemia diagnosis and chemotherapy kept Stacy away from the team. Now, instead of get well cards, the kids on the team signed baseballs. There were 25 kids on the team. It took 2 baseballs to get all their names on. And we took the baseballs to her as our get well card to her. Fortunately, Stacy was on the field when we started the next season. Then there was the day I was in the dugout before a game started. The kids were just starting to arrive when all of a sudden I heard a crash in the parking lot, in the parking area, and Judy, my team mom, screaming for help. When I ran out there, some people were taking Judy's mother out of her car. The noise I heard was Judy's mom crashing into a car and sending that car into the pole of our scoreboard. When they got Judy's mom out of the car and laid her on the ground, it was obvious she was in distress. But my advanced first aid training kicked in. Her skin was rough and scaly. I could not find a pulse, but I could see she was breathing, and I could see that her arms were moving once in a while. So I avoided or resisted the urges of the bystanders to start CPR. In a couple of minutes, the police chief arrived, and he confirmed my decision when he was able to find a pulse. So while we were still waiting for the ambulance, a car comes into the parking area, and the driver of the car is Karen. Karen is a nurse. People see Karen coming and start yelling her name. She stops her car and runs over to where the commotion is. She kneels down next to Judy's mom, and then she did something very interesting. I never would have thought of it. Karen stopped for a brief prayer. In the midst of the commotion and the adrenaline and the people yelling, Karen stopped to pray. I don't remember how long it took me to figure out the lesson I was shown that day, but eventually I did. Karen's thoughts may have been a million miles away as she was pulling into the parking area. She may have been startled by the people yelling her name. But when she knelt down next to Judy's mom, she needed to put all those distractions aside. So Karen stopped to pray. A prayer that allowed her to focus on the mission before her. So we're still in the first chapter of Mark. Just to review, John the Baptist was in the wilderness somewhere down there between Bethlehem and Hebron, preaching his message of repentance. Jesus makes a 70 or so mile trip from Nazareth down to be baptized. Heads into the wilderness for 40 days. John's arrested. Jesus walks back up to Galilee, and begins his ministry. But he doesn't return to Nazareth. He keeps going 30 or 40 miles further north to Capernaum on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue with the 4 disciples he had just called, expels an unclean spirit, and amazes people with a new teaching. And then in classic Mark language, Jesus immediately enters the house of Simon and Andrew, along with James and John. Immediately. Now, Mark uses the word euthus, meaning straight away or immediately, 14 times in the first 2 chapters of his gospel. I'm doing a reflection on the healing of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhages at the healthcare forum I'm going to next week. In those 13 verses, he uses it 3 times. 41 times throughout the gospel, we hear the word immediately. But in this particular case, the term might be accurate. It might be factually accurate, not just Mark's chosen use of language. See, archaeologists have discovered that the northern wall of Simon and Andrew's house was right under the balcony of the synagogue. So it makes sense that they would immediately enter the house. But think about it. It was like me when I lived 2 blocks from Borough Hall. They had no excuse for missing service on the Sabbath. I had no excuse for missing work on a snow day. I could walk the 2 blocks. So they walk into the house, and they immediately, of course, tell Jesus about Simon's mother-in-law. She's sick in bed with a fever. So now let's take ourselves out of the 21st century. Let's take ourselves back to the 1st century. There's no Tylenol to help reduce the fever. But more importantly, there are no antibiotics to kill the infection that was causing that fever. So this fever is an indication that Simon's mother-in-law had a serious infection that was likely fatal. Jesus took her by the hand and, according to the NRSV, lifted her up. Now, we lose something here in our English translation. Mark is telling us that this event is something very special. The Greek word used here by the author is egerio, E-G-E-R-I-O, meaning to raise up. We see that word 2 other times in Mark's gospel. In chapter 5, when Jesus takes the hand of Jairus' daughter and raises her. And then again in chapter 16, when the angel tells the women who have come to the tomb that Jesus has been raised. So Mark wants us to know that this is a very special event. Peter's mother-in-law received new strength so she could rise up and take her place in the world. Then we get to the verse that gets folks fired up. It was amazing, all the conversations on the clergy chat groups this week about this particular verse. Her fever left her and she began to serve them. Now, when I read that verse, I still hear my mother saying, "What was the matter with Simon and Andrew? Couldn't they help?" How many of us would think that? After all, this woman was recovering from a serious, severe illness. And maybe that's the point. By having this unnamed woman get up and start serving, maybe Mark is trying to tell us that the healing was that thorough that the woman was completely recovered. There was no trace of the illness at all, and she was able to return to the work she was called to do. But there's more. The word used to serve in this case is diakonio, meaning to serve or to minister. Simon's mother-in-law is the first deacon of the church. Interesting word, diakonio. It's the same word Mark used to describe the actions of the angels who ministered to Jesus in the wilderness. It's the same word Mark used to describe the women who followed Jesus and served him. And some scholars wonder if Simon's mother-in-law may have been one of those women. It's the same word Mark uses as Jesus is describing his ministry in chapter 10. Sarah Henrik tells us that Simon's mother-in-law is far from being an exemplar of a pathetic, unliberated woman for whom serving is her whole life. She is the first character in Mark's gospel who exemplifies true discipleship. Interestingly, this same word, diakonio, is never used to describe Jesus' male disciples, who never really get it in Mark's gospel. Well, then at sundown, all the sick and possessed are brought to Jesus. The text says that the whole city was gathered around. Scholars believe the population of Capernaum at the time was around 1,500 people. So 1,500 people are crowded around Jesus. And Mark simply says that Jesus cured them and then told the demons not to speak, because once again, the demons already figured out who Jesus is. So what must it have been like for Jesus to have all those people crowded around him? When we read this, it seems so innocent and so simple. We can't tell by the text whether the people were in a single file line or whether they were all crowding him and overwhelming him. We don't know how Jesus was reacting while all this was taking place. Well, about 40 years ago, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice had the same question, and they answered it this way.
Stand, I can hardly walk. I believe you can make me whole.
See his tongue, he can hardly talk.
See my skin, I'm a mess of blood.
Change my life, oh I know you can.
I believe you can make me well.
See my purse, I'm a pauper man.
Will you touch, will you lend me Christ? Won't you touch, will you heal me Christ? Will you kiss, will you kill me Christ? Won't you kiss, won't you pay me Christ?
For me, one of the most important verses in any of the Gospels is Mark 1, verse 35. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. You see, when we read the previous verses detailing the people brought to him and Jesus healing them, we are reading about the Jesus who is fully divine. Jesus is God incarnate. But there's an implication in the 35th verse that's presented more explicitly by Lloyd Webber and Rice. Jesus, we believe, is also fully human. Lloyd Webber and Rice's Jesus is overwhelmed by the crowd and responds in a very human way. And there's a term for what Lloyd Webber and Rice's Jesus was feeling. We call it compassion fatigue. It's the emotional suffering a person experiences when they are continually absorbing the distress, anxiety, fears, and traumas of others. It appears as spiritual, physical, and emotional exhaustion and a decreased ability to feel joy and care for others. Compassion fatigue can happen to any of us, doctors, nurses, home health aides, paramedics, chaplains, and family members in the role of caregivers. While Mark's Jesus apparently doesn't react to the crowd, he does display one of the tools used to prevent compassion fatigue. He sneaks away before anyone else is awake and takes time to pray. Mark's Jesus needed quiet time with God. Mark's Jesus needed to get away and pray. And if Jesus needed to get away and pray and spend some time with God, don't we? Don't we need to stop and step away from it all for quality time with God? The fully human Jesus needed to be restored. The fully human Jesus needed time away so he could focus on his mission. Now, Mark doesn't tell us or give us any indication of what Jesus' prayer was. But I wonder if the conversation with Simon and the others when they found Jesus gives us a hint, gives us a clue as to what may have been going through Jesus' mind. He expelled the unclean spirit from the man in the synagogue. He healed Simon's mother-in-law of her fever. And when the sun went down and the Sabbath was over, the whole town showed up. And he healed and expelled the demons. The news from Simon when Simon finds him is, everyone is searching for you. And Jesus answers them saying, let us go to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came to do. After Karen prayed, she did a couple of things to tend to Judy's mom until the ambulance came and took her to the hospital. Later that day, Judy stopped at the house and told me that her mom was admitted, and they were running tests to try and determine exactly what happened. Her mom recovered, and a few weeks later, she was back to her role as a volunteer with the Ladies Auxiliary of a local fire company, serving food at breakfast and dinner functions. Fully human Jesus fled to a deserted place to pray because he needed some self-care. He needed time away from the crowds and the demands of his ministry. And when Simon and the others found him, he told them it was time to move on. My mission is to proclaim the message. Jesus' prayer time allowed him to put aside the distractions and focus on the mission. What is our mission? And as things in life are moving along, do we take the time to put aside the distractions so we can focus on that mission? Amen.